This review contains light spoilers. Last Stop is a narrative-heavy game, but this review doesn't talk about any of the plots themselves. All of the main characters are mentioned in this review, as well as their motivations. Imagine meshing together a sci-fi story, a teenage drama, a family comedy, and a detective story. Ready? Alright, let's go. Last Stop is an interactive story by the people at Variable State, the studio responsible for the detective story Virginia from 2016. Last Stop is an interesting game to write about, as the gameplay mechanics are by far the least interesting aspect of the experience. I've even hesitated calling this game interactive, but we'll get to that later. First, let's travel to London in the 1980s. We start the game as we meet two people running from the police. It seems one of them has stolen a police cap, but at the end of this pursuit, we suddenly find ourselves in a sci-fi story. One of the characters walks into a strange green portal, and this is where the game starts for us. In Last Stop, we follow three main characters in three separate stories in present-day London. Each character arc consists of 6 episodes, some more lengthy than others, and the game ends with one final grand chapter. This is where everything in the story is supposed to join together. When the prologue is finished, you'll get the option to choose between one of the 3 story arcs, but you'll have to get through all of the story arcs chronologically, so you can't just finish one story arc completely and then leave the others be. If you want to know the ending of one of the 3 arcs, you'll have to play all 3 of them. The 3 characters themselves have little in common besides residing in London. I was happy to discover that the 3 stories are entirely different in characters, motivations and plot, which means the narrative keeps you engaged during the entire 6 to 7 hour journey as you jump between the different plot lines. We follow John, Miva and Donna, our 3 characters in the following storylines. The story of John is that of a rather simple but well done family comedy, where he, a middle-aged father who is struggling with his health and his job, swaps bodies with Jack, a video game developer and fitness freak. During our time with both of these 2 characters and John's rather amusing daughter Molly, we experience the craziness of swapping bodies. Having to do another person's job, act like you know complete strangers, and getting used to a different physique entirely are all aspects which you'll encounter in Last Stop. Obviously, John and Jack want their own bodies back, so they're on a quest to find out just what might have happened to them. Every narrative experience needs a character who is difficult to like, and in Last Stop that surely is Miva. She's having an affair, works for a commercial technology company and has an incredibly rocky relationship with her father. While she has the most interesting life of all 3 characters, it's her story arc that's the least developed and interesting. The sci-fi elements only happen in the latter parts of the story. Miva's motivations aren't very clear throughout, as she is dealing with a set of problems: her family, her job, and herself. The last protagonist of Last Stop is Donna, a teenager living with her mother and sister. Her sister is an overprotective police officer, while her mother is very ill. The Donna chapters in Last Stop have a very different feel to them, and in my opinion could well be adapted to be a Netflix-style sci-fi teen drama. Donna is hanging out with her friends when one of them, Vivek, tells them they've noticed something mysterious. The teenagers foolishly follow. The voice acting in the game is superb. The characters sound very natural and the writing of all 3 stories is sublime, though the quality of the characters themselves varies. Some of the side characters in particular are pretty underdeveloped, while others suck you in completely. This is where the story of Donna particularly disappoints, as it feels like more could have been done to enhance the storyline. A better cast of side characters could have helped there. Meanwhile, Miva's storyline was helped greatly by the presence of her father. He disapproves of Mina's job at a high-tech commercial company as it conflicts with his Marxist views. Meanwhile, he's taken on party drugs, possibly just to annoy his daughter. The conversations between these two characters are great and also show how all the other side characters in Last Stop are pretty underdeveloped. Overall, the writing of the game is above your average video game story, and halfway through I felt like this was one of the better narrative experiences I've had the pleasure to enjoy in the medium for quite some time. Sadly, this all seems to fall apart at the final hurdle, as the final chapter of Last Stop is a frankly disappointing mess. The way the three stories blend together feels rushed and doesn't do justice to the stories set up in the 5+ hours leading up to it. The sci-fi world building is poor at best, and the choices you get to make at the end of the game are the first bit of gameplay after an incredibly long cinematic. It's almost as if the developers gave up on making an interactive experience at the end, or simply ran out of budget and time. Nevertheless, the overall storytelling in Last Stop is very enjoyable. The developers were heading towards delivering an impressive feat of bringing a story to life in a video game, which makes the ending a bitter pill to swallow. As previously mentioned, the voice acting is great, but that's not all there is to it. The score, composed by Lyndon Holland and played by the Prague Philharmonic, shines in Last Stop. It elevates some of the moments greatly. The sad beats are emphasised beautifully, often combined with a rainy London as the backdrop of a scene. If you as a player have musical aspirations, you're in luck, as the players themselves can show off their musical skills via the inevitable rhythm minigame included, where you play the piano by pushing 4 buttons. The rhythm game lasts around 20 seconds, which leads me to the most disappointing aspect aside from the end of Last Stop, and that's the gameplay itself. Earlier I've mentioned how I hesitated to call this an interactive thriller. It obviously is, but compared to other games by the likes of Telltale or Don't Nod, I felt like the gameplay elements just didn't work well and slowed down the experience. Sure, some of the choices you make in the game have their effects on the story. The walking moments, which make up the majority of the gameplay parts, have some very nice cinematic camera angles. But overall, I feel like this experience wouldn't have been much worse off as a 6-episode Netflix show. During the 6 hours, I've had to use my controller to make characters drink coffee, or tea, or pour milk in their cereal. It just doesn't add anything to the story, and is just a way to keep players engaged while the story is unfolding. This isn't what I'm looking for in an interactive sci-fi thriller like this. The strength in these kinds of games is being a part of the story and having the means to impact it, even if it's just a slight adjustment to the main storyline. Oh, and one final pet peeve before we move on to our summary. Why is everyone walking around in regular clothes in this game when rain is pouring down constantly? We're in London, get yourselves a coat. Now look, I don't want to sound overly negative, as that is not at all reflective of my time with the game. I really enjoyed the storyline, the voice acting, and most of the characters. The soundtrack is great, and I was really pleasantly surprised by the polish and overall presentation of the entire experience. Halfway in, I was truly thinking about how this was one of the better narrative experiences I've had in interactive entertainment in quite some time. But there are also aspects of Last Stop I just wasn't that impressed by. The ending should have been better, and that's not just due to the overload of very soft sci-fi that happens near the end. I love sci-fi. In addition, the gameplay itself just wasn't very engaging. Interactive storytelling is a difficult genre to get right, as it requires both an interesting story and a story that can be interacted with by the player. You want your actions to have meaning, you want them to matter. In Last Stop, this isn't always the case, and combined with the filler gameplay segments, this is the aspect where the game let me down a bit. Overall, Last Stop is a well-crafted game by a very talented independent development team, which will keep players engaged for a couple of hours. A polished and well-built experience. But sadly, the journey is definitely more interesting than the destination with this one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this review, be sure to hit subscribe, ring that notification bell, and stay tuned to XboxEra. See you next time.